Good afternoon, good people. And thank you for joining us for Net Ecological Gain, Improving Ecosystem Conservation Efforts. And I think our colleague Marcus is going to share his screen.
Yep.
Great. Okay. As indicated by the catchy title, this webinar is co-hosted by Deloitte and EOS, the news magazine of AGU. My name is Carol Sue, and I'm the editor-in-chief here at EOS. And at this point, I'd like to sneak in a sentence and tell you a little bit about us before we get started. AGU is the world's largest community of Earth and space scientists, and EOS is proud to publish a wide variety of news for our members, for other scientists, and for the science-interested public. EOS.org is updated every day, and we hope you all bookmark it right now, eos.org. And with that, we can go to slide 2, please. Thank you. The purpose of today's webinar is to convene a diverse group of stakeholders, including peers from government at the state, federal, local, and international levels, NGOs, and industry, to discuss leading practices, challenges, lessons learned, and case studies related to science, policy, and technology that can inform the development and frameworks for the implementation of net ecological gain. And we'll get to what that is in a moment. First, we will hear from Steve Panks, who has been spearheading the design and deployment of biodiversity metrics in the UK. Then our colleagues at Deloitte and Esri will share how they're working on harnessing advances in technology to improve monitoring and measurement of our natural resources. And we will close with the director of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who's exploring statewide deployment of net ecological gain. And let's go to slide 3, please. Okay, net ecological gain, NEG, is an approach that aims to ensure that development, and other human resource, let's start again. Net ecological gain is an approach that aims to ensure that development and other human activities result in a net positive impact on the environment. This means that any ecological losses are not only compensated for, but are actually exceeded by ecological gains, leading to an overall improvement in the ecological health and biodiversity of the region. The concept of NEG builds on the principles of no net loss, NNL, which seeks to balance ecological losses with equivalent gains. NEG, however, goes a step further by aiming for an actually net positive outcome. As the world faces increasing environmental challenges, including habitat destruction, biodiversity loss, and climate change, it is crucial to adopt more ambitious and proactive strategies like NEG to protect and restore our ecosystems. Effective design, implementation, and monitoring of policies addressing the ecological conservation and restoration are essential for achieving these goals. And next slide, please. Thank you. At both the federal and state level, there has been some movement toward both NNL and NEG, but with mixed results. At the federal level, the National Environmental Policy Act and other regulatory measures have aimed to move agencies to NNL as they take federal action that impacts the environment. There are similar policies at the state level, such as the California Environmental Quality Act or the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act. However, reporting across the impact of these policies has often shown minimal to no movement towards actual no net loss. And that's enough from me. If we can move to the next slide, please. Let's hear from Steve, the Principal Specialist, Biodiversity, Net Gain, and Biodiversity Metrics for Natural England. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Carol. Thank you for having me this afternoon as well. I'm just going to give you a bit of a run through around the expertise and experience that we've had in England in taking forward biodiversity net gain, which is our version of what we're talking about today, and the biodiversity metric, which underpins it and provides that key aspect of measurability. So if you can move us on to the next slide, please. So as I've just said, it's really fundamental to the whole net gain approach is having a metric that provides that measurability that everybody can start to see that those gains are tangible. They bring them to the fore once you can actually sort of measure them, and once you can actually measure things, people start to think about managing them if you can measure them. So that's the key kind of aspect of the biodiversity metric, and that's the element of biodiversity net gain that I've been working on in the UK. It's something that has been in gestation for about a decade now. It evolved from the biodiversity offsetting pilots back in 2012 that we had here. And then there have been various adaptations of it as England has sort of moved from offsetting through that no net loss space and into biodiversity net gain. And Natural England started to really update the metric and try and make it work for biodiversity net gain round about sort of 2016, 2017, following industry sort of getting into adapting various different versions, and we wanted to get a standardized metric that was used rather than a plethora of different metrics all telling different stories. So that's the sort of potted history, if you like, and the rationale for it. One of the key things the metric does is establishes a baseline, so what's happening before any development starts or any project starts, and then it forecasts a likely outcome way into the future and then compares the difference between the two. So that's what the metric is actually doing. It's measuring that either loss or uplift between those two sort of states in time, really. It uses habitats as a proxy, so it's a habitat-based metric, and then it translates them into biodiversity units. So that's the numeric value of the metric, and that is more tangible, we're finding, than hectares or any other sort of quantifiable sort of size rating for metrics. The thing to flag, though, is it's not a complex ecological model. It is a simple and sound approach based on ecological advice and ecological expertise feeding into the numerics behind it. It's very much a trade-off between the science and the data that underpins it, but also a framework that is feasible and fairly inexpensive to measure and is replicable for others kind of taking that forward. And one of the things that we're finding is it's a great aid to communication for non-technical audiences. So it's something that takes what's happening in the field and the language of the ecologists is then being translated into a language that's understood in the boardroom. So that's a sort of knock-on effect, really, of the metric. If you can move us to the next slide, please. So very quickly, in terms of an overview of the metric itself, it's a robust, repeatable, standardized set of values. There's been a lot of work gone into those, and I'll talk through that a little bit later. It reinforces the mitigation hierarchy, which starts with that avoid. And with biodiversity offsetting, there was that sort of emphasis on going straight to compensating for. So one of this things that putting a value on something is doing is actually reinforcing the cost of doing something and therefore making people think twice about it. Anecdotally, what we're starting to see is ecology built into that design rather than bolted on afterwards, as has been the case for decades through development. So we're starting to see those early conversations around how do we actually incorporate ecology into the design? How do we get architects and landscape architects and engineers and ecologists all talking to each other? And we're starting to see that happen now, coalescing around the metric approach. So what it does is it's recognizing key habitat attributes like habitat size, habitat type, habitat condition, and then it's looking at delivery risks around how long does it take to recreate if a habitat is destroyed, how difficult is it to recreate or restore, and where is it located in the first place, and where is it going to be recreated? So it's recognizing that importance of place. So those are the key kind of elements of the metric. And then just finally, before I move on, it's an aid to decision making and should be viewed in that context rather than just as a decision making by numbers tool. It's very much relies on having that full ecological input and the ecological evidence and rationale to be brought alongside it. So if you can move us to the next slide, please. So just to give you a very brief kind of overview of how the calculation works. So this is the baseline calculation. What you can see in the green there is requires user input, and then the blue requires, well, it's drawn from data that's already in the tool. So what the tool's doing is taking a habitat area or length, multiplying that by the distinctiveness score that's pre-populated within the tool, multiplying that by a condition score, and then by a strategic significance score. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. And that gives you a baseline biodiversity unit value. If you can move us on to the next slide, please. So what happens then is in the sort of forecasting outcome phase, that same calculation as was done at the baseline is rerun. And then in addition to that, what's actually happening then is it's starting to factor in how difficult it is to restore that habitat. And that's pre-populated by data that's already in the tool, and there's huge amounts of work gone into that. Similarly, it looks at the time that that habitat is going to take to get to its target condition. And that data is all pre-populated. So everybody's working to standardized values within the same tool. And then separately, the ecologist or whoever's looking at the metric needs to identify whether it's being created fairly close to where that loss is or some distance away, and looks at the sort of risk for that as well. So it's factoring in that element of place. If you can move us on to the next slide, please. So this is really just quickly to illustrate the range of contexts that it can be used in and the range of scales. So it can work for small and large housing developments, for commercial developments. It can work in the sort of infrastructure space for road and rail projects, for river restoration projects, for sort of ports and minerals developments as well. And it can even be used right at that land purchase stage. So before any development is even proposed on a site, what's its ecological value? What's the impact of ecology? Bringing that ecology right to the forefront of decision making there. So if you can move us on to the next slide, please. So this is just to give you a sense of the ecologist's role in the field in filling this in. So their job is twofold, really. Firstly, identifying from the habitat classification systems that are used in the metric which habitat they're looking at on site in the first place, and then assessing its condition against a predetermined set of variables. And there are a whole range of different condition assessments that are published with the metric for different habitat types. And then the ecologist comes to a view as to what condition it is and feeds that back into the metric. If you can move us to the next slide, please. So alongside thinking about what's there at the baseline, the ecologist will also be looking at what's going to happen in this predicted outcome scenario. Am I going to retain habitat that's there already? Am I going to enhance habitat and make its condition better or improve it so it becomes a higher distinctiveness habitat? Or am I going to compromise that habitat with development and then create some new habitat either adjacent or somewhere else entirely? So the ecologist will be thinking about
Hi,
those
how are you?
various different interventions there as
I'm
well.
good. Very good.
If you can move us on to the next slide, please. So this is where the metric starts to be able to influence where development happens and where, more importantly, where investment goes into biodiversity. So it's designed to be able to work on site and be able to sort of help create sort of greener developments through design, but it's also designed to be able to link to other plans and policies to start facilitating strategic creation of habitat so that we can get those bigger areas, those more joined up areas of habitat rather than fragmented habitat being created across the piece. And then, as I said earlier, separate to that, what it also does is penalise if development is in one place and habitat is compromised and then it's created miles and miles and miles away from where that loss is. It will also act as a disincentive for that behaviour as well. So if you can move us on to the next slide. This is just to give you a flavour, really, of how we've come to the point that we've come to in terms of the underpinning sort of values. So they're based very much on ecological judgment and expert opinion, not only from Natural England and our own habitat specialists, but we've been out several times to consulting with NGOs and their ecologists or other professional ecologists working in the development sector. and we've built that consensus around the various values that are underpinning the metric. They're all based on the assumption that they're values for the average site rather than the best site or any old site. It's the average site. And the other assumption that's gone into those values is that the hydrology or the soil or kind of what other environmental constraints that are on site are also factored into those numbers. So when you're creating a particular habitat, it's assumed that the land is being created on has the right hydrology to create that habitat in the first place as well. And so what we've done is run some frequency analysis, and we've run about 1.3 million lines of data through the biodiversity metric, trying to sort of tackle virtually every conceivable output that it can have and looked for outliers. So we've looked at where they're kind of grouped close together and where the values are a little bit wide of the mark, and looked at their relative value of each habitat against each other, as well as the values that underpin the individual habitats. And then we've contrasted that with expert opinion, and then refined some of those values and republished. And the metric's been through several iterations. So we started, as I said, with the pilot metric in 2012. Then we've had version 2, 3, 4, and then the statutory metric. So over time, those values have settled down. But in the early days, we were just continuing to refine those and work with others. If you can move us on to the next slide, please. So the metric is sort of governed by a set of rules and principles, and one of those rules is around habitat trading. So that governs which habitats can be swapped. So when a habitat is lost, what it has to be replaced with. So this is the trading rules from an earlier version of the metric, from metric 4, but the others follow the same principles in that the higher distinctiveness habitats, the more stringent the trading rules are. So for high distinctiveness habitats, those are our sort of priority habitats. We're looking at a replacement on a like-for-like basis in England. And then the further down you go, the less importance, then the more opportunity there is to trade different habitats for one another. So if you can move us on to the next slide, please. So this is just something that works alongside the metric, and it's a register of net gain sites that we decided needed to be done to safeguard against things like double counting of any sort of site enhancements, to be able to keep track of what's going on and to provide that transparency so that it's a publicly available register, and it's designed to take data from the metric and then hold that and make that publicly available in the UK. So if you can move us to the next slide, please. So just a little bit now around where we are and where we're heading with this. So now the statutory metric's been published, that's expected to remain stable for the next 3 to 5 years or so, to allow industry to get used to that, to be able to be in a space where it's not constantly chopping and changing, and they can get used to that being stable. But behind the scenes, Natural England is continuing then to review and explore various options within that constraint of keeping it simple and sound, and not turning it into a full-blown ecological model. But some of the things that we're looking to do is sort of strengthen the evidence base behind the metric, looking to assess the impact of some of the multipliers and just to see what happens. So have a play behind the scenes. What happens if we adjust something? Are the multipliers working the way that we've intended? Are there any perverse outcomes? That sort of analysis is being done behind the scenes as well. And then we're looking to explore the potential of how we might use any new techniques and technologies that are sort of coming through at the moment. So things like remote sensing and AI, how we might use that alongside new technologies like eDNA and audio acoustics and those sorts of things. And it's all very much in that exploratory phase at the moment. But that's a sort of direction of travel that we're looking to do. Can you change to the next slide, please? So just very quickly, some sources of further information there, should anybody require it. There's some hopefully useful links for others to follow as a follow-up. And then if you can move us on to the next slide, please. Just to say thank you for having me, and then to pass back to Sam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. So for those who are in the audience, we do have a Q&A feature. I'm also going to temporarily allow everyone to unmute themselves if there are any questions for Steve at this time. All right, Steve, you did such a good job explaining. Oh, Morgan, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for this. I'm just curious if you encountered any, concern or opposition more in the lead up to passing this law and this program, and if so, what have you seen to be effective to help people, build support for this work?
Okay, so we ended up with this being largely an industry-led approach in the UK to start with. So there were some that were sort of continuing to use the metric after the offsetting pilots had finished. Some that were just finding it very useful to be able to use a metric to articulate their corporate responsibilities and things like that. And gradually it gained traction. Then we ended up with industry working together with government to publish some best practice principles. And then it gradually started to snowball from there. So then we had changes to the planning policy framework, which removed some of the potential sort of blockers, and that laid the pathway to the legislative approach that we've got. Obviously, there have been sort of challenges and concerns, and I think we've tried to address those largely by working with others to try and sort of have regular consultations, to actually be in active listening mode and to bring others with us on that journey rather than just trying to drive things through.
Thanks, Steve. And you have a couple other questions now. For Byron, we will be sending out the links in the presentation afterwards. And then it sounds like there's a question around, have industry and private landowners seen particular advantages of contributing to gains?
So I think they're still working that through. The market is in its infancy at the moment, but they are largely kind of the NGOs and others are sort of leading that space. But there are private sort of habitat banks that are starting to crop up and see the advantages of that. Where developers are seeing the advantages in a smoother ride through the system, in that sort of aid to communication and decision making and that earlier intervention, so they don't have to worry about ecology kind of as a bit of a follow-up later on that might come to change things. So I think that's where the advantage is for those.
Thank you, Steve. Anybody else? Any questions? All righty. Well, thank you, Steve, so much for sharing your experience with us. And we will also be including information at the end for those that may want to reach out for more either information or discussion. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
All right. If we can go to the next slide, Marcus, I will go ahead and pass it over to Fabian.
Hi everyone, I'm Fabian Loyer. I am the Managing Director at Deloitte, and I support our nature services offering as well as our climate change and sustainability team. So we heard from Stephen about the importance of quantitative metrics as a tool for auditing and accounting for biodiversity in support of net ecological gain and the no net loss policy. Of course, there are some inherent challenges associated with implementing these natural capital policies, and the reason is quite simple. You simply cannot change or manage what you cannot measure. Can you please move to the next slide? Next one. Yeah, thank you. So accurate measurements are indeed critical to environmental management, as they are used to set baseline, track effectiveness of investments and management interventions, and of course, ensure compliance with policies. Concurrently, advances in Earth observing system technologies and geospatial analytics are enabling more accurate and comprehensive accounting of key environmental indicators. And by Earth observation or Earth observing systems, I mean both remote sensing satellite as well as in situ sensor and sensor network, all of which are key to measuring ecological health, biodiversity, and the overall sort of like nature type parameters. So in the past 5 years or so, and fueled by the commercial space industry, there has been an exponential growth in remote sensing technologies, leading to a rapid increase in both the quantity and the quality of Earth observation. For example, the spatial, temporal, and spectral resolution of the data is higher than ever before, allowing for greater insights. And I love these stats, but to give a sense of magnitude of the quantity of the data that we generate, it amounts to about 100 terabytes per day. So what does that mean? Well, think that this corresponds to about 10 times the quantity of printed material of the US Library of Congress, which is 39 million books. So every single day we produce almost 400 million books worth of data in terms of Earth observation. Fully harnessing and capitalizing on this rapid acceleration in the availability and quality of Earth observation data will be key to the success of the global biodiversity agenda. As you can imagine, mining and deriving actionable insights from this global geospatial dataset can be challenging as it is resource intensive. It requires massive compute power, advanced analytics, and specialized skills. The good news is that many of the major, I would say pretty much all of the major hyperscalers, those are the cloud provider, have developed cloud-based platforms with AI models that allow users to easily access and analyze publicly available Earth observation data at scale for a wide range of applications. So those AI models, which are deep learning or machine learning models, are essentially helping users detect changes, identify patterns, map trends and anomalies within the data set, and again, at global scale. So it's important to point out that this type of large-scale analysis would not be possible with the traditional geospatial analytical approaches, mainly because of the sheer size of the data sets and hence the use of machine learning, deep learning, and cloud computing. So some example of application of these AI-powered cloud-based capabilities include producing dynamic, on-demand, high-resolution maps of land use, land cover change. You can track, as many of you already know, illegal deforestation, but you can now track illegal mining, illegal dump sites. And for today's purpose, we will show how they can also be used to assess and monitor habitat integrity and ecological health, both of which are key to track progress towards net ecological gain goals. So another important technological advancement that I would like to briefly talk about is the transformative power brought by generative AI, particularly because of the ability of Gen AI to create new content without direct human input or intervention. So the traditional generative AI applications like chatbot that everybody knows about are made possible by what's called foundation models. So these foundation models are large language models like AI models that are trained on a huge amount of text. For example, the latest version of GPT, GPT-4, was trained on 300 billion words. But as we know, most of the important and most relevant information about the environment is not so much in text, but in Earth observation. And so one of the most exciting and most cutting edge area in our work at the intersection of AI and nature is the development of similar foundation model, but for Earth observation. So these would be large machine learning or deep learning models that are trained not on text, but on geospatial data like satellite imagery. So this Geo AI model can be adapted and fine-tuned for an infinite number of downstream tasks and any kind of environmental application at scale and almost on demand. Similarly to the way that anyone can use Gen AI to create an automated response to an email, the ability to deploy, interact with these powerful Geo AI models to create new insights will become more and more accessible to non-specialized users. Another very important point is that these new AI models hold the promise of dramatically reducing costs associated with measuring, reporting, and verification. So MRV, which we know it can be very costly and not always very scalable. And those, measuring, reporting, verification processes are in support, of course, of the implementation of the global climate and the nature agenda. So now I'm going to pass it to Marcus, who will show us concretely how Earth observation data can be leveraged, and particularly when coupled with AI, can be used routinely and effectively to underpin biodiversity and other ecological metrics that are key to support the net ecological gain policies and implementation, which now can be much more data-driven than ever before. Marcus?
I believe we're actually starting with Jennifer. So Jennifer, if you want to go ahead.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to do demos after my presentation, right? Great. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Fabian. I think that was a great kind of good segue into what I wanted to talk about today around GIS and Esri and how it can support these ecological net gain initiatives. So I want to thank you all for having me here today. Again, my name is Jennifer Von Gibson, and I am the Esri Services Manager for the Environment and Geodesign Industry team here at Esri Professional Services. So next slide, please. All right, before I get it, for those that do not know who Esri is, we are a technology company that was founded in 1969, and we create geospatial tools and infrastructure. Our platform is known as ArcGIS, and many of the GIS mapping and spatial analysis methods now used around the world were created with Esri technology, which we're very proud of. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So we all know that sustainability requires that we see the world as one single ecosystem. Geography, or the science of the world, as Esri likes to say, provides the science and language to support that effort. It helps us organize and integrate all the environmental factors like biodiversity and ecosystem services, and integrates them with economic systems, and then allows us to spatially start to see those connections. It allows us to integrate them with social factors, then again will help us illuminate these patterns and relationships. It helps us provide a framework for understanding and applying our knowledge. Next slide, please. The geographic approach is a way of thinking and problem solving that integrates this geographic science and information and how we understand and manage our planet. It's a holistic approach that bridges multiple disciplines and sciences. It's integrative, collaborative, and supported by spatial thinking. And next slide, please. And to tie it all together, GIS is the tool that enables this geographic approach. GIS and the geographic approach provides that framework for applying that integrated geographic knowledge widely. Next slide. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about ArcGIS, Esri's core foundational technology. It's an integrated system that brings many components together and has been engineered to work as a single system supporting many kinds of applications and people. Next slide, please. And we think about it as fundamentally three systems. First, a system of record that takes account for that transactional data management, a system of insights for analytics, and what I love, that system of engagement through apps and maps that connects people and their organizations' work, that helps them communicate and share that information. So you're probably thinking, how does this tie all together to net ecological gain? So next slide, please. So what I love is that GIS can play a crucial role in many elements relating to looking at net ecological gain initiatives. Here is just a few that I'm capturing on the slide. It can help through ecosystem mapping, spatial analysis, my favorite, stakeholder engagement, and that monitoring and evaluation. What I love about the stakeholder engagement is that GIS can create those engaging maps and visual tools that enhance that communication with stakeholders, which then allows us to promote that transparency and decision-making. Next slide, please. And so I want to take a few moments to talk about a really cool case study. I mean, I'm a little biased, but a great case study that shows how GIS can help us understand better information and create better data to help us solve our world's environmental problems. So this is talking about an initiative and a project that looked at mapping wetlands in the state of Tennessee. Many of you probably know that given the vital ecosystem services that wetlands provide and the rapidly changing landscape, both physically and a regulatory context, contemporary wetlands data is crucial. Advances in machine learning and high-resolution data sources now make the rapid production of wetlands data possible. Our great partner SkyTech, in partnership with Esri, we've developed a new comprehensive approach to predict wetlands in the state of Tennessee, making it the largest and first statewide application of this approach. SkyTech used the Esri Arc Hydro Wetland Identification Model, also known as WIM, as part of their approach, integrating it with their advanced methodologies and skill sets to predict these wetland locations. Next slide, please. So that WIM model utilizes LiDAR, elevation data, and machine learning to identify areas where wetlands are expected to occur across the landscape. The workflow predicts likely wetland areas from a set of hydrologically based indicators that are derived from very high resolution DEMs. We were fortunate to be able to use ArcGIS for Planetary Computer was used to bring ready-to-use analysis tools from ArcGIS to the Microsoft Planetary Computer, which allowed us to distribute the processing and scale rapidly. So what we have here is we were able to take that physically informed data, imagery and training data, coupling that with that deep learning modeling and cloud computing, which gave us the statewide wetland screening tool. And I'd be remiss that a really important aspect of this approach was that we really needed to establish high quality training data through subject matter experts and professional networks. That's what really set this project apart from other wetland mapping efforts. That's a mouthful. SkyTech had the expertise to closely develop and curate training samples along with extensive high-quality data that was received from key stakeholders was essential. Next slide, please. So at the conclusion of the effort, SkyTech received extremely positive feedback from wetland scientists in the state of Tennessee. And it enabled them for the first time ever to really quantify the extent of wetlands that were at risk within the state. But what gets me really excited about this workflow and this approach is that it's repeatable. It's easy and has high potential impact. We have a recipe for identifying these wetlands and building that valuable foundational data set. By pairing that high quality training data with that WIM model, new imagery, and that high performance computer environment from Microsoft, we were able to scale a successful analysis at the state level with a desire to push this to other states and hopefully take it globally for wetlands identification. So very, very excited about that. So thinking about this in foundational data, the last thing I wanted to cover, and next slide, please. And Fabian kind of really honed in on this, is that we all know that data is critical for all aspects of environmental management. And what's beautiful about ArcGIS that it includes already a set of ready-to-use content that can be used to support your work. This includes over 10,000 and more growing high-quality maps, layers, and data sets that are updated regularly and support billions of users each day. Next slide, please. A really exciting thing I wanted to highlight. I don't know if y'all are familiar with iNaturalist. It's a pretty well-known citizen science network of people sharing plants and animals and kind of being their own citizen science. It's a nonprofit. They have great resources, and it's a really great place to find species collected by everybody. So next slide, please. The reason I'm so excited about it is that data is now available in the Living Atlas for the first time ever, which now gives us global research grade observations that are updated. They're already ready to go in real time. So just another great resource for you all to get access to. And last slide, please. But wait, there's more. There's always more. In addition to all that data that I showed before, there's a growing environmental data aspect in ArcGIS Living Atlas. We have data from all around the world that cover different themes of land cover, climate, habitat, soil, geology, just to name a few. So to recap, GIS is great and it can support many different aspects of net ecological gain in several ways, whether it's mapping or calculating and monitoring, and ArcGIS can provide those tools and data to support those workflows. And that's it. I think there's one more slide. And that's my contact information too.
Awesome. Any questions for Jennifer on Esri or the power of geospatial technologies? All right. So then I guess we can go ahead and move on to Marcus. As I mentioned, everyone's contact information will be available at the end, and we'll make sure to distribute. So if you do have any questions and are just maybe too shy to ask in this forum, everyone will be available to you afterwards. All right. Thanks so much, Jennifer.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Taylor. I'm a nature services consultant and a data scientist here at Deloitte. So now that we've heard a little bit about the background and the data that goes into topics such as GIS, AI, and biodiversity net gain, we can now pivot to how advances in these areas have enabled effective measuring and monitoring of net ecological gain. To demonstrate this, we've actually developed a proof of concept to both show this possibility and how it can be used with AI to reduce the manual labor hours typically associated with measuring ecological change. So this proof of concept started with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where together we were able to gather the functional requirements and success criteria for putting net ecological gain into the hands of the end users. Then, with collaboration from researchers at the University of Colorado at Boulder, we're able to identify the best available scientific practices, as well as the data sets necessary to bring net ecological gain to reality. Using these methods, we were able to bring this data together to create meaningful and valid insights in an interactive proof of concept. So to bridge previous gaps and prove the art of the possible with respect to net ecological gain, this proof of concept will work as a three-tiered process of visualizing, collecting, and reporting on the data. Data is brought in from both public, national, and state-specific data sets, then broken down into very specific assessment units to allow for interoperability of the data of different types and resolutions, which can then be scaled and visualized via Google Earth Engine and reported on using both custom analytics and generative AI. So to demonstrate these capabilities, we've actually prepared a brief demonstration. So I'm going to quickly shift my screen here. So starting from the home screen, we're going to click Get Started, and the tool is going to ask us to select our role to assist with providing us the data and analyses that are most relevant to our needs. In this case, we're going to act as a county executive interested in measuring changes in land use at the county level. So I'm going to choose that I'm a county executive and select county boundaries, then select forests as my measurement of interest since I am looking for changes in land use. And now we're going to notice that it has prompted us with several different indicators for analysis related to changes in land use. However, if I were to say go ahead and maybe be looking at an example of looking for changes in conservation areas at the state level, I would be provided with an entirely different set of indicators. But once I've selected my indicators for analysis of interest, I can select these and move on to the visualization using Google Earth Engine. Now we're going to start by seeing an aggregate view of our units of interest. In this example, we're going to be looking at counties, but this would also apply to things like watersheds and any other boundaries of interest. Here we can see at an aggregate level and see which of our units have shown the most positive or negative change, at which point we can actually go and drill into a more specific unit of interest here for a more detailed analysis. So here I can select a specific county, and this is going to show us detailed metrics about this county in particular. Currently, we're looking at land use metrics, but if we were, for example, looking at things like conservation or urban planning, we would be given more detailed metrics around those specific units of interest as well. Now, maybe in this region, we want to look for something different. We want to look for something like the ideal place to construct a new well, or to create a forest conservation zone, something that we would need to add additional data for. We can begin to aggregate different data from nearly any data set by adding layers onto this map. In this example, I want to look at how land use has changed in different protected habitats. So I'm actually going to pull in Washington's priority habitats and species data on top of our current region. And by doing this is going to allow us to build a more refined analysis and build our collection very specific to the data that we want to report on. So now that I've built all of the data that I want to add to our collection, I can actually move into how this tool can be used for reporting. So now that I have added this to our collection, I can move into the Managing and Reporting menu. And we're going to see that to reduce the amount of labor typically associated with building these reports, a series of pre-generated reports are going to be created based on the roles and indicators of interest that we selected previously. So just to rehash, we did go ahead and look at changes in land use at the county level. So most of our analyses are going to be primarily focused on this, but we can also see if we were more interested in things like biodiversity or land use, we will have different reports for those in particular as well. Now, if I scroll back up, I can also see that we have reports on ecological functions assessments and for species and habitats assessment, since we had previously mentioned that we are going to be interested in the species and habitats data. If, for example, we had gone and looked for the ideal spots for a new well or any other use case, these would also be included in our pre-generated reports. So once we have actually gathered all of the visualizations and data that we plan to report on, we can further reduce some of the labor associated with reporting by augmenting our report with generative AI. So using generative AI, we can actually ask the tool directly to create a summary catered directly to our audience. Whether that be a scientist, a legislator, or an executive level audience, this can be used to quickly create textual summaries at the appropriate level for both the technical audience and the layperson. So now that we have gone and built our report entirely, we can select to generate this report into a variety of accessible formats and choose to include in the report our natural language processing summaries to fully generate this report from start to finish very simply for a variety of use cases, for a variety of functional end users, and for a variety of audiences. And that concludes the presentation on the Net Ecological Gain proof of concept. So I'll switch back now to the slides and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Marcus. Does anyone have any questions about either the proof of concept and how it came together, the previous conversation around GIS and advances in technology as a whole that contribute to improved monitoring in this space? All right. Well, as mentioned, we'll have materials at the end and we'll be able to share anything offline that people may be curious about as well. All right, and moving into our final segment of the discussion, we will actually be, Marcus, if you don't mind, stopping the screen share. We're going to actually have more of a dialogue with kind of a use case in action that we're seeing in the US right now. So Washington was kind enough to lend us Morgan Carlson for the day to talk through how they have been thinking about their net ecological gain proviso and the work that they're doing to explore net ecological gain and its potential application in the state. So Morgan, thanks so much for joining us today and would love for you to introduce yourself briefly to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Really my pleasure. Hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Carlson. I'm the Director of Conservation for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. So nice to see so many names and a few familiar names on there, but I'm hopeful maybe we can spark through this dialogue a little bit more question, and be wonderful to see a little bit of the interplay and how these ideas maybe play out or the things people wonder about in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So Morgan, I think, speaking of the community that's here today, a lot of us are of the mind that we should be moving towards nature positive as an imperative for our planet. But I think a lot of us find it hard to convince leaders outside of this space that taking serious action and moving more proactively towards NNL and NEG is of the highest importance. how is it that Washington has been able to make strides in getting people on board and becoming kind of the forefront of net ecological gain exploration in the US?
I think we have a few things that are, negative things that drive urgency. And then I think we have a few sort of natural assets in our socio-political environment. Thinking about some of the things that create urgency for Washington, we have a number of many, I wish I actually knew the number, I should have looked that up, but many listed species. So species that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We have a corollary law here in Washington through the Department of Fish and Wildlife authorities, where we are listing by virtue of criteria different species that are experiencing declines and are in peril. Some of the most notable ones that folks out there in other parts of the country or the world might have heard about, we have many species of Pacific salmon listed. Those are fish that are anadromous, meaning they come up into our watersheds in the state and then they spend a goodly portion of their lives out in the ocean. We also have some wonderful charismatic megafauna. We're lucky enough to have orca here in the Pacific Northwest, and one of our orca species, the so-called southern resident, is imperiled. And so for decades, really, that has driven a tremendous amount of effort by communities, by different scales of organization to work on salmon recovery. And then, of course, we are lucky enough to have many Native American tribes in Washington, and our Native American tribes here in Washington really have generations upon generations of a stewardship ethic for nature, and have really helped to drive awareness of some of what living with that nature and managing that nature looks like. So that's sort of a bridge to the assets that we have. And then I think as I mentioned, we have a socio-political operating environment in many parts of the state that has a sort of care for nature. There are some great surveys that have been done nationwide. One that comes to mind is America's Wildlife Values. And these are studies that use systematic social science methods to really gauge what are people's values around nature and our responsibilities as people for nature. And one of the things that we've seen repeatedly over successive years or versions of that survey is that Washington, along with a number of other states, is on the leading edge of a growing number of people whose values and attitudes around nature have to do with stewardship and sort of a responsibility for people to care for nature. And so I think that helps to build into a situation we have today where, we have a growing political environment in our state legislature where it's sort of taken as a norm on some level or a given that here in Washington, we do have some of that responsibility. And then I would be remiss without naming folks, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that, much like that Margaret Mead quote, we've had a small group of thoughtful, committed people looking to change the world here, and I think willing to be a little bit controversial in doing that.
Amazing. And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but why do you personally see NEG as an important initiative for WDFW to help drive forward? And what do you feel is at stake if you're not able to kind of make this a reality soon?
Yeah, I talked about some of those imperiled species. Much of my personal perspective, or how I would summarize it, is informed by the lens of the work that I've done for a long time here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. But I think I would describe it this way. We have a pretty robust set of laws between our state and some of the federal laws, city and county ordinances for protecting the current condition. Now, we're not getting there, and that's probably a whole different conversation I could maybe reference later. But even if we do that perfectly and we implement those set of laws perfectly, the best we can do is protect the natural resources that remain today. And that's not really good enough, right? Not only are we having trouble implementing that policy, but there are many sort of harms to Washington's environment, to the species, to these ecosystems that we live in too, that happened before we created even the protection laws. So again, the best we can do is what we have, protect what we have today. And I think there are many of us that I can speak about, a little bit later, who want to see improvement. We want to see fixing of some of those legacy harms that many people agree, like, yeah, that's not how we would do that today, or that's not how we would live and work on the landscape today. And I think when you add a lens of a changing climate on top of that, and our greater understanding about the relationship to human health and well-being, both psychological and physical, of having access to a healthy environment and knowing that it'll be there, I think it just adds to that sense of urgency and imperative. And with Washington's human population growing, we're the second smallest state on the West Coast of the United States with the second largest human population and growing. We've exceeded our population projections, at least for the last 10 years. And so again, I think for me personally, and I think there are others that feel this way, this feels like a pivot point. Are we going to do things the same way we have up until this point? And I think we know how that plays out. Or are we going to step back and take some of the risks associated with taking the opportunity to change kind of the trajectory of how we live and grow and develop?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we heard from Stephen earlier a little bit about how the UK is looking at moving biodiversity net gain forward. How have you and your team been thinking about approaching like the framework of NEG and putting together an approach for Washington?
Well, I think we're the team working on it now, myself included. We're building on that Margaret Mead group of thoughtful, committed people who came before us. So Washington has been contemplating policies, programs, funding mechanisms to achieve gain for a number of years now. Currently, we were assigned what we call a proviso from our legislature. We received an assignment from them with some direction and a little bit of resources to further build out a framework to try to make recommendations about what would a set of net ecological gain policies and programs and funding mechanisms look like for Washington, or what could those look like? And it was a pretty detailed proviso. So that proviso asks us to define what the gains should be and at what geographic scales those should apply and sort of be evaluated. It asks us to identify the criteria that we would use to measure and assess results. We need to make associated policy and budget recommendations about how those ideas and definitions could be implemented. And we need to identify how, in particular, how state-administered programs or state-funded programs and projects either already do contribute to gains, or perhaps more importantly, how they could moving forward if funding criteria or conditions of those state funds were used differently. And then hopefully to look for a county, which is our sort of political subdivision below the state, to look for a county who's willing to volunteer to help demonstrate what this could look like. So that's kind of providing quite a bit of structure about how we're trying to develop this framework. And we can talk a little bit more about, maybe what's working well or what the opportunities are and what's challenging about that.
Yeah, and in this kind of dialogue, you've mentioned kind of the counties and the relationship that you have there, and then some of the indigenous peoples that you're working with in the state, as well as like the state legislature. So how are you all driving collaboration around this important topic? Like, what's the approach you're taking there?
On some level, that kind of collaboration is just good government that probably any of us who are associated with government are familiar with, or right, like working with fellow governments, including here in Washington, tribal governments or stakeholders. And so that's also really a culture here in Washington, particularly starting when many of our salmon species were listed in the late 1990s. Washington has really grown and developed this idea of sort of ground up participation in defining a future and defining policies moving forward. So it's not a surprise that that proviso from our legislature included direction around expectations that we'd be collaborating with fellow state agencies, tribal governments, city and county governments, as well as stakeholders and communities and nonprofits who are really engaged in this work. We've been to sort of meet that cultural expectation and legislative expectation. We've tried to set up structures in our work that reinforce the collaboration and yet are also manageable. It's not, you get some things done with a smaller group of folks who are really dedicated and coming together again and again to wrestle with tough issues. And so we have a core team of, I don't know, it's maybe about 20-ish people that represent some of those groups and entities that I mentioned. We're also trying to set up more open-ended workshops to bring in many more people. There's sort of a different set of feedback and insight you get when you have many, many more people in a virtual room. So those are maybe the technical structures that we've set up, but we're also trying to set up a culture within our working groups of respectful dialogue. There are many places, where we all talk about the importance of diversity of thought and experiences coming into a conversation like this to sort of build durable policies and programs. And in my experience, the corollary to getting that important diversity of thought experience in a room is also having norms around, oh my God, how do we have these conversations when we're automatically including many more people that don't agree at the outset? And that those cultural expectations for respectful dialogue and really listening as part of that don't give us the solution. But our hope is that is an asset as we dive into some of the gnarly topics that we're encountering.
And I know we were going to discuss this a little bit later, but since you brought it up, what kind of opposition is Washington seeing with this, and kind of how are you addressing it or dealing with it along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk later about technical challenges too, but maybe more to your point. The biggest thing the thing that I really lie awake sometimes at night thinking about how to move forward is more a legal and a social challenge. And I think the opposition grows from the fears and concerns coming from this. So Washington, as I mentioned earlier, we're really fortunate to have a long history of tribal governments and tribal partners in this work. In particular, we have 29 federally recognized Native American tribes, 24 of whom are parties to treaties between those tribal governments and the federal government. And these treaties don't give rights to tribal governments. They express the reserved rights of Washington tribes to hunt and fish and gather. There's case law now, some of which is very old, and some of which is newer. And the newer case law is helping to establish that those treaties include a reasonable expectation that those fish and wildlife and plant resources will actually exist and be available for tribes to exercise those treaty rights. And so through that lens, actions that impact and reduce fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats are infringing upon those treaty rights. At the same time, the US Constitution and the state constitution include provisions for private property rights, and that includes limitations on the ways that government can infringe upon those private property rights. And so through that lens, it is more clear how the government can pass laws that prevent harm, and it's less clear to what extent the government can require a private property owner to fix a past harm that isn't necessarily connected to something that they did while they were the owner, excuse me. So courts in the United States haven't really weighed in on the interaction between those two parts of law. And I say all of this because it means that there's a really healthy debate right now, both in the context of our net ecological gain work and really just more generally in our state about what kind of laws are sufficient to support treaty obligations and the rights of our tribal governments here in Washington, and then conversely, what's too much relative to private property. And so, I mean, it makes sense, hopefully to you as I'm describing this, that what I understand from tribal government partners that I talk to and that I hear from is an incredible sense of pain and urgency about the way harms over the last 200 years have infringed on treaty rights, and that what that means culturally and spiritually as there are limits on those treaty resources. And we hear from people who have responsibilities either in government or maybe they are thinking about those private property rights. And I think there's fear and concern about what government might tell them to do, or how far that direction might go. We don't have that figured out. I mean, I really wish I was here already telling you all how we've fixed that and figured it out. But again, I go back to what I said earlier, which is I think I know we will have trouble succeeding if the conversations in the context of our work turn into a public policy debate where people are entrenched in positions. And I'm not judging that, because there's reasons for people to have each of those perspectives. But my fear is that we won't be able to make progress or actually get some change passed through our legislature that makes progress towards these gains. Again, it doesn't provide a silver bullet, but we're working hard to not create public policy debate, but see if we can really create public policy dialogue. I think one of the assets we have, hopefully, will be tapping into creativity and innovation about how to use some of the existing regulatory tools, maybe sharpen the teeth we already have there, or use those teeth in new ways, along with more purpose-driven programs for incentives that really remove barriers or provide compelling reasons for people to engage in the kind of gains behaviors that we want to see. So I would say it's still in action, Sam. And again, I'd love to hear questions from folks to help us dive into that more. Maybe folks have creative ideas out there too.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions here. They're not related to that topic, but one is, has Washington explored a biodiversity metric like Natural England?
That's a great question. I learned a lot about biodiversity net gain in England today. I was saying to Stephen, I think in some of our prep, I have poked around on the website and looked at materials, and there's something powerful in hearing someone knowledgeable like Steve summarize that. So no, I wouldn't say we've come up with exactly the same metric. We do, I think, have a few different models that have maybe been used for different purposes, maybe to track efficacy of restoration efforts that have happened before that are more voluntary efforts, or efforts in the context of something like salmon recovery, which I mentioned earlier. We're doing a little bit of work here in the department right now, trying to think about how to bring together some of the existing but still limited species data we have to identify biodiversity core areas and how that might interact with land use. But I think one of the things that resonated for me with Steve's remarks is this idea of something that is scientifically credible and rigorous, and yet simple enough to be implemented on a wide scale effort, and hopefully not have sort of like the cost of running a complex methodology become the inhibition itself. So if you could see my notes here on a page, I have dive a little deeper into UK's metric on my list.
Amazing, thank you. And then the next question that's on here, it says this is for the whole panel, so maybe at the end we can give others an opportunity to weigh in as well. But so much of science is becoming transdisciplinary. What are the opportunities and challenges with NEG when embracing that cross-sector movement?
I'll start with challenges first so I can end on what the opportunities are. I mean, I think the challenges for me, again, it resonated when Stephen talked about those trade-offs between the complexity and sort of synergistic effects that I think we're learning about through the scientific lens. But then when you're implementing a government program or set of policies, you need to be able to have definitions and methodologies that essentially, for lack of a more technical term, sort of boil that down in a way that can be communicated, implemented, and then we can hold people accountable to that. And we've wrestled with that in our NEG work. Many of the folks who are most interested in developing these programs, I think, are either scientists or deeply technically trained or have exposure to that. And I think my observation is I think it's really tough to, I think doing something more simple and boiling it down is almost more tough than expounding on the complexity that we're encountering. But I think that relates to some of the opportunities, seeing what Marcus highlighted earlier. I think tools that we can bring into play that allow us to tap into both remote sensing data and AI tools, particularly, and I'm showing some of my bias, don't give us an answer that we just sort of blindly pick up, but give us some answers or options to guide our inquiry and decision, along with, frankly, just tools to visualize some of that complex data in ways that allows our amygdala of our brain that works well with multiple variables to sort of see how that can come together and inform decision. And so I do think there's some ways that this technology can help us if we can help ourselves to accept a little bit of simplification, I think, for the purposes of making decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that concluded the questions that were asked as of now. So before we go to the full Q&A, I think one more question we had around the challenges and successes that WDFW is seeing. Are you running into any other obstacles, technical or otherwise, when it comes to trying to implement NEG in this space that you either feel would be worth sharing with this group or could maybe solicit input from this group or others about?
Yeah, maybe the other challenge that I would throw out there, and I'd be very interested for other folks on the panel or folks in the audience to reflect on this. It's a little bit of like the limitations of our human brain. So I guess I'm expanding on my answer about the challenges, but a couple of things, we I think have a hard time as humans in this sausage making or starting with a blank slate, creating something that we haven't seen before, whatever analogy that you want to use. I think much of our tendency is to turn to tools we already have and ask how they might inform. And I think there's some pros and cons there. I think one of the cons for us here in Washington, and I think maybe even right in the kickoff, Carol might have mentioned it, we've got a lot of evidence that our existing system of protecting the resources we have today is not working well. We continue to see declines, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And so as we try to talk about, well, what from that system do we want to use? Because I think the difficulties of creating something entirely from scratch, practical, mental, and psychological, are really difficult. I think we're collectively having a hard time here in the state getting over our realization that the existing system isn't working. So getting down to that next level of detail, and this is maybe where the folks here can help. What bits and pieces of a framework, whether it's the metrics or monitoring programs or subsets of criteria that reflect ecosystem function that we feel are really great proxies, sort of like the initial place to start, that we have seen work, we've seen them be effective, we've seen our ability to hold people at site and project scales accountable to those. I think those are great building blocks to start from. And it's a way we're trying to shift right now and inject some of that into our project too.
And thanks for sharing that for everyone. I think we are now at the Q&A portion. I'm going to go ahead. Everyone who is on the line, you have the ability to unmute. We also still have the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Morgan and what the WDFW team has been working on, please feel free to unmute yourself or put your question in the Q&A, and we'd be happy to answer, or for the broader panel as well. All right.
Don't be
And then I
don't be
guess,
shy, guys. There are no silly questions. I'm learning as we make this sausage from scratch.
all right. And then I do want to open it up. I know that the question around the transdisciplinary piece of this work was really directed at the full panel as well. So I don't know if Steve or Fabian, Jennifer, Marcus, anyone have anything else that they might want to add on that question?
Yeah, I can come in on that, Sam, a little bit. I think it brings some challenges around perhaps too much complexity kind of coming in from the different disciplines all competing against each other for space is one thing, but I think more than that, it brings a huge amounts of opportunity in just getting people across disciplines talking. Nature is very connected. The way that humans interact with nature is very connected, and the way that different industries are siloed and they need to be communicating and cross-pollinating with each other. And I think that multidiscipline space, and if we can start to develop multidiscipline tools that can be accessed from different perspectives, brings huge opportunities that probably, in my mind, outweigh the challenges. I think we just need to be mindful of that kind of complexity of drilling down too much. That's my view, but others might have different things to say.
No, I think that was perfect. Thank you, Steve. Any other thoughts from our panelists? Any other questions from the broader group? Okay. Well, I realized I did not introduce myself in the beginning, so apologies for that. I'm Sam Reamer. I work for Deloitte as well and am a senior manager in our nature services leadership team. So Carol Sue, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you to close this out. But oh wait, we got a question. Has Washington seen growing difficulties in adopting policies due to the growing political polarization in this country?
I have a hard time imagining anyone would say no to that. I mean, that's I feel like that shows up everywhere, including the environment. And it's why, I mean, it's sort of the subtext of why I have been focusing so much in my remarks here and the approaches that we've been using in this work to moving past debate, moving past identity politics in some cases, because that certainly gets tied to environmental work, in order to hopefully find shared values or shared outcomes. So yes, certainly, and we've seen that, certainly show up in issues that are outside of my professional responsibility for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. At the same time, I think, Washington, our political dynamics are stable to some degree too, just in terms of how our population tends to vote. Now let's see, November or next Tuesday or the following Tuesday, it could all be thrown off, but there definitely, as I referenced earlier to that America's wildlife values, we have some indications of stable and growing values around care for nature. So that's maybe a little bit of, as I said, an asset, and yet it just means that a majority is swamping out the concern, right? And the debate and the differences. That's probably not a super helpful answer because I'm just basically saying yes. But a part of me kind of loves that that's a part of my challenge and responsibility as a public servant, is trying to figure out how to move through that. You should come back and we'll ask in, a year how successful we've been able to be for this project.
Thank you, Morgan. And Jennifer, it looks like there's one for you. The Esri example in citizen science was interesting. Any other examples of that, especially in climate justice groups? Oh, Jennifer, I think you're on mute.
I was like pressing the button and it was like not.
Weird.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I love the iNaturalist example. I think it's a premier citizen science. It'd be really great to see something similar for environmental justice, climate justice. That's I will take that back to my colleagues on the Esri side because that is really interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if a platform like iNaturalist could extend in some of these topics. It is already has such a large network already, but that is a really great question. Maybe that's our next solution that Esri can think to make. So I love that idea.
So that was anonymous, but whomever you are, maybe reach out afterwards and the
Absolutely.
collaboration could start. Amazing. Any other questions? Okay, well, Marcus, if you wouldn't mind just showing the screen of all of our information again, we'll send this out after so you have the contact info of everyone who spoke today. And I'll pass it back, Carol Sue, to close this out.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who participated, either by delivering information or asking those great questions. As you can see, for everyone in the United States, I voted this morning. You all should too. Make your voice heard for climate and everything else. A video of this meeting will be available, and we'll share that with you tomorrow morning, so you can watch it for fun later this weekend. And with that, I think I will close this out unless anybody had any final questions, comments, concerns. Okay, thank you. Bye.